The candles were the kind that relight themselves after you blow them out. Lily and Oppo's idea, bought with her own allowance money from the drugstore on 5th Street, and Margaret Doyle laughed for the first time in longer than she could remember when the little flame sputtered back to life for the third time. End quote. Grandma, you have to blow harder, end quote. Lily said, 6 years old going on 40, hands on her hips. End quote. I and Oppo's am 70 years old, sweetheart. This is as hard as I and Oppo's got. End quote. It was the first birthday since Frank had been gone that Margaret had let herself enjoy, and she noticed that fact the way you notice a held breath finally released. Frank had always made a production of her birthday, a scavenger hunt around the yard when they were young and broke, a weekend in Asheville once the kids were grown, and in his last years when his hands shook too much to wrap a present properly, a card that took him 3 tries to sign because he wanted his handwriting to still look like his handwriting. He and Oppo's been gone 2 years now. The house on Larkspur Lane still smelled like sawdust in the garage where his tools sat untouched, and some mornings Margaret still turned to tell him something before she remembered. Tonight there were 7 of them around the dining table, Margaret at the head, her son Ryan at the other end, Ryan and Oppo's wife Nicole across from Margaret and Oppo's old friend Dolores Fenn, 2 of Nicole and Oppo's co-workers from the dental office who and Oppo's been invited for reasons Margaret still didn't and Oppo's fully understand, and Lily, wedged between Margaret and an empty chair that had, for 2 years now, simply stayed empty. Nobody ever suggested filling it. Nicole had done the cooking. A roast, mashed potatoes, green beans with the little slivered almonds Frank used to pick out one by one and leave in a small disapproving pile at the edge of his plate. It was a good dinner. Nicole was, when she wanted to be, an excellent cook and an even better hostess, warm and quick with a compliment, the kind of daughter-in-law other women at church said Margaret was lucky to have. Margaret had believed that once. She was no longer sure what she believed. Lily had leaned close during the gift opening, her breath smelling like the strawberry lip gloss she wasn't and Oppo's supposed to have yet, and whispered and quote, Grandma, I wished you and Oppo's stay forever. Like not go anywhere. Like Grandpa did. And quote. Something in Margaret and Oppo's chest folded in on itself. She pulled Lily against her side and pressed her lips to the crown of her head, breathing in the shampoo smell of her hair, and said and quote, that and Oppo's a fine thing to wish for, baby. I plan on sticking around a good long while yet. End quote. It was 20 minutes later, over coffee, that Lily reached for the gravy boat and knocked her water glass sideways. It wasn't an Oppo's tea, even a large spill, a few ounces spreading in a dark bloom across the white tablecloth Margaret had owned since her own wedding. End quote. Lily, end quote. Nicole and Oppo's voice cut the air like a blade unsheathing. End quote. I and Oppo's am sorry I didn't and Oppo's mean, end quote. Nicole was already up, chair scraping back, and her hand moved fast, faster than thought, faster than anyone at that table could intervene, and the sound of it, palm against a small cheek, was the loudest thing Margaret had ever heard in her own dining room. Lily and Oppo's head snapped sideways. Her small hand flew up to grab the table edge to keep from toppling out of her chair. The room went utterly silent. Dolores and Oppo's fork clinked against her plate and stayed there suspended. One of the co-workers stared very hard at her napkin. Ryan, Margaret and Oppo's son, a grown man of 36, reached for the wine bottle, refilled his glass, did not look up. Lily did not cry. That was the detail that would stay lodged in Margaret and Oppo's chest for months afterward, sharper than the slap itself. The girl straightened in her chair, pressed the back of her hand to her reddening cheek, the careful, practiced way of someone checking a bruise that has already happened before, and said nothing at all. Then she slid down from her chair, walked the length of the table, and wrapped both arms around her grandmother and Oppo's leg, pressing her face into Margaret and Oppo's cardigan. Margaret looked across that table, past the ruined tablecloth, past the birthday cake with its self-relighting candles gone dark, past her own son refilling a wine glass instead of standing up, and felt something inside her that had been coiled tight for longer than she wanted to admit go very, very still. She stood. Her chair legs scraped against the hardwood. End quote. This is my house, end quote, she said. Her voice came out low and even, quieter than anything else in the room, which somehow made it louder. End quote. Get out. End quote. Nicole and Apo's mouth opened, closed. And quote, Margaret I and quote, get out. And quote. Dolores gathered her purse without being told twice. The co-workers made their exits in under 2 minutes, murmuring about needing to relieve a babysitter neither of them had mentioned before. Ryan sat very still, his wine glass halfway to his mouth, looking at his mother with an expression Margaret would spend a long time trying to name. Not defiance. Not quite shame either. Something closer to a man watching a wall he and Apo's built collapse and not knowing which piece to catch first. Nicole left last, heels sharp against the hardwood stairs, not a word exchanged in either direction. Margaret carried Lily up to bed herself, even though her hip had been arguing with her about stairs since March. Lily was quiet the whole way, her cheek warm against Margaret and Apo's neck, her small fingers curled into the collar of Margaret and Apo's cardigan like she meant to hold on through the night. End quote. Does it hurt, sweet girl? End quote. Margaret asked once Lily was tucked in, keeping her own voice level with an effort that cost her something physical. Lily touched her own cheek, testing it the way you and Apo's test a bruise on a peach. End quote. It and Apo's okay, Grandma, end quote, she said. End quote. It happens. End quote. It happens. 2 words delivered the way a 6-year-old should talk about rain, or a skinned knee, or running out of her favorite cereal. Not about the back of her mother and Apo's hand at her grandmother and Apo's birthday dinner. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed until Lily and Apo's breathing slowed into sleep, and then she sat there a while longer, because she was not yet ready to stand up and be the person who had to decide what came next. She didn't and Apo's sleep. She lay in the dark of her own room, Frank and Apo's side of the bed still faintly indented after 2 years, some habits the mattress hadn't and Apo's unlearned any more than she had, and turned the evening over and over, looking for the moment she should have seen it sooner. There had been signs. She could admit that now, lying in the dark, in the specific unsparing way a person admits things at 2 in the morning. Lily flinching at raised voices that Warren and Apo's even directed at her. Lily going quiet and careful whenever Nicole and Apo's mood shifted, the way a barometer needle swings before a storm even breaks. The way Nicole sometimes looked at Lily, not with the soft unguarded love Margaret remembered feeling for her own children, but with something colder. Assessment. As though Lily were a recurring inconvenience rather than a daughter. Margaret had noticed all of it, in pieces, and had told herself each piece meant nothing on its own. That was the lie grief let her tell. That was the lie 2 years of watching her son and Apo's marriage from the sidelines, exhausted from her own loss, had let her tell. She got up before dawn and went down the hall and eased Lily and Apo's door open. The girl was awake already, sitting cross-legged on her bed with a stubby crayon, hunched over a dollar store notebook with the concentration of a surgeon. She startled when the door creaked. Margaret watched her small shoulders rise toward her ears, chin tucked down, the whole body bracing before she registered who it was, and then relax. End quote. Morning, Grandma. End quote. End quote. Morning, baby. What are you drawing? End quote. Lily held the notebook out. Proud in the unguarded way children are proud before the world teaches them caution. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and turned the pages slowly. The first few were what you and Apo's expect: a lopsided house, a cat with too many legs, a rainbow that didn't and Apo's quite arc. She smiled at those. Then the pictures changed. A tall figure with a raised arm, heavy black crayon strokes. Beside it, small, a figure with its arms pinned to its sides. Another page. A child in a corner, the corner scribbled over so many times the crayon had worn a hole clean through the paper. The child had no face. Margaret and Apo's hands went still. The last drawing in the book was different. An old woman and a small girl, holding hands, walking toward a big yellow circle that could have been the sun or the moon. It was the only page where the child had a face at all, and on that face a smile. End quote. Lily. This one. Is that us? End quote. Lily glanced over, still coloring something else. End quote. Yeah. We and Apo's. Going somewhere safe. End quote. End quote. Where are we going? End quote. A one-shouldered shrug. End quote. I don't and Apo's know yet. But not here. End quote. Margaret set the notebook down very carefully, the way you set down something that might shatter if handled wrong. She stood, walked to the doorway and stepped into the hall, pulling the door most of the way shut behind her. She pressed her back against the wall and put a hand over her mouth and stood like that for a long moment. The only sound in the house, the air conditioner cycling on somewhere below. She had buried a husband. She had sat through 11 months of chemotherapy appointments holding his hand and believing that was the hardest thing life would ask of her. She had been wrong. She went back in. Lily hadn't and Oppos. T moved, unbothered, as if her grandmother stepping out and coming back in were part of the ordinary weather of a morning. End quote, Grandma, end quote. Lily said, not looking up. End quote, do good girls get hit? End quote. Margaret sat down beside her. Took a slow breath. End quote, no, end quote, she said. End quote, good girls Don and Oppos T get hit. Nobody who loves you hits you. That is not what love looks like. End quote. Lily considered this, crayon moving in slow circles. End quote, okay, end quote, she said in the tone of a child filing something away that she wasn't and Oppos. T sure she believed yet but badly wanted to. Margaret went downstairs, made coffee she didn't and Oppos. Tea taste and called her daughter before 7 in the morning. End quote. Mom it and Oppos. It's not even light out yet. End quote. End quote. I know what time it is, Renee. End quote. Something in her voice must have reached through the phone immediately, because Margaret heard the rustle of sheets, and then her daughter and Oppos' voice came back sharper, wide awake. End quote. What happened? End quote. Margaret told her. All of it. The dinner, the sound she would never fully unhear. Lily walking to her grandmother instead of her mother. Ryan and his wine glass, the drawings. She kept her voice flat, the way she and Oppos' learned to deliver hard things over 60 years of a life that had asked her to deliver a fair number of them. Renee was quiet for a beat too long. End quote. I and Oppos am booking a flight. End quote. End quote. Renee, you Don and Oppos T have to. End quote. End quote. I and Oppos am booking a flight, Mom. Don and Oppos T argue with me. End quote. Her voice cracked just slightly on the last word. Renee was 38 and ran a forensic accounting practice out of Portland, the kind of work that required her to be professionally unshakable. Margaret had rarely heard that crack in her voice since she was a teenager. End quote. How long has this been going on? End quote. Renee asked once she and Oppos steadied herself. End quote. I Don and Oppos T have the full shape of it yet. End quote. End quote. Does Lily have marks anywhere visible right now? End quote. End quote. The one on her cheek from last night. End quote. A sharp inhale. End quote. Mom, listen to me. Do not confront Nicole again before I get there. Don and Oppos T let her know you and Oppos rethinking about anything. Can you do that? End quote. Margaret looked out the kitchen window at the tire swing Ryan had hung for Lily 2 summers ago. The one Lily hadn't and Oppos T touched in months. End quote. I can do that, end quote, she said. End quote. I and Oppos I'll be there tonight. End quote. Margaret hung up and stood at that window a long while, coffee going cold in her hand. Down the street, Dolores Fenn and Oppos' sprinklers came on, sweeping slow arcs of water across her lawn. Dolores herself was already out on her porch with her mug, the way she and Oppos been most mornings for the 12 years she and Margaret had been neighbors. She caught Margaret and Oppos' eye through the glass. She didn't an Oppos wave. She just nodded, once, slow and deliberate. The nod of a woman who had been waiting a long time for exactly this morning to arrive, and was relieved it finally had. Ryan and Nicole left for a lunch reservation at noon without asking whether Lily wanted to come. Margaret heard the car back out of the driveway and stood in the kitchen counting to 30 before she let herself move. She went up to Frank and Oppos' old closet. There was a zipper pull she needed for Lily and Oppos' jacket, and fixing small things with her hands had always been how Margaret settled a mind that wouldn't and Oppos' settle on its own. A habit 30 years of raising 2 children and 40 of marriage to a man who fixed things for a living had worn into her. Her hand reaching past Frank and Oppos' old flannel shirts that still, faintly, carried the smell of cedar and machine oil, closed around something metal. A tin. Square, painted with a faded rose pattern, The kind that gets repurposed year after year to hold buttons or screws, or nothing in particular. She had assumed all of Frank and Appo's odds and ends tins had gone to the donation pile after he passed. This one apparently had not. It was heavier than a tin of buttons had any business being. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. Inside, a spiral notebook with a faded floral cover, the cheap dollar store kind. A sealed envelope with her name on the front, written in Frank and Appo's uneven later years handwriting, the letters tilting the way they had once his hands began to tire. And a photograph face down. She picked up the notebook first. It wasn't an Appo's diary exactly. More of a log. Short entries dated in Frank and Appo's economical hand. October 14th. Nicole told Lily to stop crying or she and Appo's give her something real to cry about. The girl had scraped her knee on the porch step. She stopped crying immediately. She already knows to stop. November 2nd. Tried to hold Lily in the kitchen while Nicole was on the phone. Nicole came in, said I was making her soft, that she needs to learn to self-soothe. Lily looked at me over her shoulder as Nicole carried her off. I won and Appo's forget that look. December 9th. Lily was left in her room from 2 in the afternoon until Ryan got home at 6:30. I knocked at 4. Nicole said she was resting. She wasn't in Appo's resting. I could hear her in there. Margaret had to stop. She set the notebook on her knee and stared at the wall and breathed through the burning behind her eyes, slow and deliberate. 40 years of marriage and she had known every room Frank had ever walked into, every expression his face was capable of making. He had watched all of this. He had sat in this house and logged every date with hands that shook a little more each month, and he had said nothing to her, because she hadn't and Appo's been ready to hear it, and they had both known that without ever saying it out loud. She turned to the last entry. The handwriting was smaller here, more careful, as if he were rationing what strength was left in his fingers. Maggie, if you and Appo's. Rereading this, it means I was right and I and Appo's. I'm sorry I couldn't and Appo's stay and fight it with you. But I didn't and Appo's leave you empty-handed. Promise you that. She held the notebook to her chest for a moment, then turned the photograph over. Lily asleep, cheek against Frank and Appo's shoulder, his arm curved protectively around her. Late afternoon light through a window, the particular gold of an autumn evening. Frank and Appo's face turned slightly toward the camera, unposed, caught in a moment of such uncomplicated tenderness that Margaret and Appo's throat closed entirely. On the back in pencil, "This is what love looks like, Maggie. Fight for her." She sat with that photograph a long time, long enough that the afternoon light crawled a good 6 inches across the bedroom floor. Finally she opened the envelope. A single folded sheet, letterhead she didn't and Appo's recognize. Cho and Amp. Vance, Elder and Family Law, 4th Street, Millbrook. A confirmation of appointment. Frank and Appo's name at the top. A date April 8 weeks before he died. Underneath in Frank and Appo's pencil script. He knows what to do. Walk through his door and tell him what you and Appo's seen. He and Appo's I'll take it from there. He and Appo's a good man, Maggie. I made sure of that before I trusted him with this. Margaret read it 3 times. Then she said to the empty room in a voice scraped raw and quote, "You went to a lawyer. While you were sick. While I sat in that waiting room every Tuesday thinking the hardest thing I and Appo's ever do was say goodbye to you. You were out here making sure Lily Wooden and Appo's be left alone." End quote. She picked up her phone and searched the number. Office hours Monday through Friday. Tomorrow was Monday. That evening after Lily was asleep, Margaret sat with Renee in the kitchen going over what she and Appo's found while Renee and Appo's suitcase sat still zipped by the door. End quote. There and Appo's more end quote, Renee said after a long silence. End quote, there has to be. Dad wasn't and Appo's the type to leave half a plan. End quote. She was right, though neither of them yet knew how right. The next morning, Margaret carried a plate of biscuits across the yard to Dolores and Appo's porch, the oldest excuse in any neighborhood for showing up uninvited before 8 a.m. and having it be perfectly acceptable. Dolores was, as always, already there. 78 years old, coffee in one hand, the paper folded on the railing beside her, though half the news in it was 2 days stale. End quote. I wondered how long it drove himself over. Parked crooked in my driveway, which was how I knew something was wrong before he even said a word. Sat right where you and Appo's re-sitting. Sharp as a tack that morning, thin as a rail. End quote. She looked out at the street. End quote. He had an envelope. Asked me to hold it until you came looking for it hard enough that you needed it. End quote. Margaret and Appo's chest was doing something complicated. End quote. And last night watching you at that window. End quote. Dolores went on. End quote. You looked like a woman who and Appo's finally stopped pretending. End quote. She went inside. Margaret heard a drawer open and close. Dolores came back with an envelope. Margaret and Appo's name in Frank and Appo's hand across the front. Margaret didn't and Appo's open it yet. She held it in both hands. End quote. What else have you seen from next door? End quote, she asked. Dolores wrapped both hands around her mug and was quiet a moment before she answered. End quote. I and Appo's seen that little girl on the back porch at 7 in the morning in her pajamas. No breakfast. Just sitting there by herself, staring at the yard like she was waiting on something that wasn't. And Appo's coming. End quote. Her voice tightened. End quote. I and Appo's seen her left out there when it was 92 degrees while Nicole was inside on the phone. I and Appo's heard the way that woman talks to her through the fence. Margaret. A person doesn't and Appo's talk to a child that way. End quote. End quote. How long? End quote. End quote. Since she was about 3, best I can tell. End quote. Dolores and Appo's chin lifted. End quote. I should and Appo's come to you sooner. I know that. But Frank asked me to wait until you were ready. Said you and Appo's come when you were ready and not a minute before. End quote. A pause. End quote. He knew you very well. End quote. End quote. He knew me better than I know myself. End quote, Margaret said. Dolores reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out an old phone. The screen cracked at one corner. End quote. I started recording about 6 months back. I know it in Appo's not my business. But I kept thinking about that little girl on the porch and I kept thinking about what Frank had told me. End quote. She held the phone out. End quote. It and Appo's all in the gallery. Dated. End quote. 23 videos, some 12 seconds, some closer to 2 minutes, all shot through the gap in the fence line, angled down into the Doyle backyard. Margaret pressed play on the first. Lily standing in the yard holding a toy. Nicole and Appo's voice sharp through the tinny speaker. Get inside, I told you 10 minutes ago. Now. And Lily moving instantly, head down, shoulders rounded. The way a child moves when the speed of her obedience has been trained into her. Margaret handed the phone back without watching further. Not because she didn't and Appo's need to see the rest. Because she already believed it, and watching it frame by frame on a porch in the morning light was more than she could manage right then. And she needed to keep something intact for what came next. End quote. Can I have copies? End quote. End quote. Already emailed them to myself. Printed the worst ones too. End quote. Dolores said it plainly. End quote. Frank taught me to keep backups. End quote. That surprised a short, painful laugh out of Margaret. End quote. Of course he did. End quote. She opened Frank and Appo's envelope, then, the letter, the appointment confirmation, both read twice. When she looked up, Dolores was watching her with the patient look of a woman who and Appo's already read whatever was on Margaret and Appo's face and drawn her own conclusions. End quote. He planned all of it. End quote, Margaret said. End quote. He had 8 months to plan. End quote, Dolores said. End quote. And he loved that little girl something fierce. End quote. A pause. End quote. He loved you something fierce too, Margaret. That and Appo's why he built it this way. He knew you and Appo's need proof before you and Appo's let yourself fight. So he made sure you and Appo's have it. End quote. The screen door opened behind them. Renee stood in the doorway in yesterday and Appo's clothes, hair flattened on one side, coffee mug in hand. She looked at the envelope in her mother and Appo's lap, then at Dolores, then at Margaret. End quote. Mom. Is that what I think it is? End quote. End quote. Sit down, Renee. We and Appo's got a lot to talk about. End quote. Renee sat on the porch steps and wrapped both hands around her mug, and looked at her mother with Frank and Appo's eyes steady and unafraid of whatever came next. Down the street, a truck pulled into a driveway. Walt Kowalski got out, saw the three of them assembled on Dolores and Appo's porch and stopped. Read the situation the way old friends do without needing it spelled out. He crossed the street, climbed the steps, and sat down on the railing without waiting for an invitation. End quote. All right, end quote, he said. End quote. What are we doing? End quote. Walt had a logbook. Margaret hadn't, and Appo's known that until he pulled it from his shirt pocket right there on the porch. A small spiral notebook, the cover worn soft from months, in a pocket. He opened it to a page near the middle and tapped it with one finger. End quote. 3 times, end quote, he said. End quote. May the 9th. May 21st. June 3rd. Always between 10 and noon. Always when your car wasn't, and Appo's in the driveway. End quote. He looked up at Margaret. End quote. Frank asked me to keep an eye out for anything unusual, back before he passed. I kept doing it out of habit, honestly, more than anything else. Man drives a gray sedan, carries a briefcase, stays 45 minutes to an hour. End quote. Renee had her phone out before he finished the sentence. End quote. You get a plate. End quote. End quote. Course I got a plate. End quote. Walt said it like it was obvious. He tapped the notebook again. Renee typed, thumbs moving fast. A mockingbird worked through its repertoire in the oak at the edge of Dolores and Appo's yard. Somewhere down the street a lawnmower started up. 3 minutes passed before Renee looked up. Her face gone the particular stillness of someone keeping something under tight control. End quote. Cascadia Assessment Group. They and Appo's a consulting firm. They do capacity evaluations specifically for conservatorship petitions. End quote. She looked at her mother, making sure she was following. End quote. That and Appo's when someone goes to court and argues another person, usually elderly, usually with assets, ISN, and Appo's capable of managing their own affairs anymore. If the court agrees, a conservator gets appointed to make financial and personal decisions for them. The person loses legal control of their own life. End quote. The porch went very quiet. End quote. Ryan and Nicole, end quote, Walt said. It wasn't an Appo's a question. End quote. They and Appo's need documentation to file, end quote. Renee went on. End quote. An assessment saying mom shows signs of diminished capacity. Someone and Appo's been coming into the house and evaluating her mom 3 times while you were at your appointments. End quote. Margaret thought back over the last few months, her Tuesday visits to the cardiologist, how Nicole always offered to drive her, how Margaret always said she was fine on her own, and how Nicole had always seemed faintly disappointed by that answer. She had chalked it up at the time to a daughter-in-law and Appo's concern. End quote. She wanted me out of my own house, end quote, Margaret said slowly. End quote. She wanted control of everything in it, end quote, Renee said. End quote. The house, the accounts, your medical decisions. All of it, running through her hands with a court order behind it. End quote. End quote. Can they do this without her knowing? End quote. Walt asked. End quote. They can file without her knowledge, yes. The visits get framed as wellness checks. It and Appo's essay standard playbook. End quote. Margaret thought of a woman in a gray blazer who had come by twice that spring, polite, saying she was doing, end quote, community outreach for seniors, end quote, asking if Margaret managed her bills all right, whether she and Appo's had any falls recently, whether she ever felt confused about the day of the week. Margaret had answered every question, glad someone was checking in. End quote. She told me she was doing outreach, end quote, Margaret said, and heard the fury creep into her own voice for the first time since the birthday dinner. End quote. That and Appo's the script, end quote, Renee said. End quote. It and Appo's designed to feel harmless. End quote. She scrolled further. End quote. Mom. Their standard turnaround on a completed report is 30 days. The last visit was June 3rd. That and Appo's end quote. She did the math. End quote. 26 days ago. End quote. Walt understood before Margaret did. End quote. So the report might already be finished. End quote. End quote. which means a petition could be filed any day, said it might take a while. End quote. End quote. He was right. End quote. End quote. He usually was, from what I could tell. End quote. He gestured them into chairs across from his desk. On the corner sat a framed photo. A woman and 2 grown sons, sunburned, grinning on a lake dock. A man with his own family. A man who understood what one was supposed to look like. End quote. Your husband came to see me in April of last year. End quote. Cho said, settling into his chair. End quote. 8 weeks before he passed. He was very specific about how this should go. End quote. He opened a folder and read from a handwritten note clipped inside. End quote. Maggie will try to fix this herself if she knows too soon. She and Apos S been the one holding this family together for 50 years, and she thinks she has to keep doing it alone. Let her find this when she and Apos S desperate enough to finally let someone help. End quote. Renee pressed her lips together, eyes bright. End quote. That and Apos S exactly how he talked. End quote. She said, more to herself than to either of them. End quote. He gave me a full account of what he and Apos D observed over roughly 2 years. End quote. Cho continued. End quote. The way Nicole treated Lily. The financial patterns he and Apos D noticed. His concerns about your vulnerability once he was gone. He was thorough. And he left something with me to give you personally once you came in. End quote. He opened a drawer and set a small flash drive on the desk between them. Renee looked at it, then at her mother. End quote. Mom. End quote. End quote. I know. End quote. Margaret said and picked it up and held it in her palm. Small. Lighter than it had any right to be, given what it apparently contained. End quote. He recorded it himself at home about 6 weeks before he died. End quote. Cho said. End quote. Said it was for you first. He was very particular about the order of things. End quote. Margaret closed her hand around it. End quote. What else did he leave? End quote. Cho turned to another section of the folder. End quote. A trust clause. A provision built into his portion of the estate that activates under specific conditions. If Lily is determined by a court or child welfare authority to be living in an unsafe environment, full guardianship authority transfers to you, Margaret Doyle, immediately, superseding parental rights pending full legal review. It and Apos S drafted, witnessed and notarized. It will hold. End quote. Renee exhaled slowly. End quote. He built a trapdoor into his own estate. End quote. End quote. That and Apos S one way to put it. End quote. Cho said. End quote. And the conservatorship threat. We believe Ryan and Nicole may be close to filing. End quote. End quote. I and Apos V already flagged your mother and Apos S name with the county clerk and Apos S office. End quote. Cho said. End quote. If a petition is filed, I and Apos L'll know within 24 hours. End quote. He leaned forward. End quote. What I need now is everything you have. The neighbor and Apos S recordings. Your husband and Apos S journal. The bank records. The assessment firm and Apos S paperwork. All of it. End quote. They spent the next hour laying it all out. Dolores and Apos S videos, Walt and Apos S logbook with its dates and plate number, screenshots of the assessment firm and Apos S own website describing its conservatorship services, Frank and Apos S journal, the tin. Cho read without interrupting, making notes in a hand so small Margaret couldn't and Apos T have read it from across the desk. When he finished he sat back. End quote. Mrs. Doyle, here and Apos S where we stand. What your daughter-in-law appears to have done with your finances, if the numbers bear out, constitutes financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. What she and Apos S done with the assessment firm, commissioning an evaluation without your knowledge as part of a conservatorship scheme, adds fraud to that. And what Dolores Fenn and Apos S recordings document, combined with your husband and Apos S journal and Lily and Apos S drawings, is the foundation of a child welfare case. End quote. End quote. What do we do first? End quote. Margaret asked. End quote. We file a report with the county and Apos S Department of Children and Apos S services today. That starts the clock. End quote. He looked at her steadily. End quote. And then, Mrs. Doyle, you let me do my job. End quote. Margaret looked at this man Frank had found and vetted from a hospital bed with months left to live. She looked at the photograph on his desk. The sunburned sons, the laughing wife, the lake dock. End quote. He picked well, end quote, she said. Cho almost smiled. End quote. He told me you and Appos. Dee say that too. End quote. They got back to Larkspur Lane a little after 4. Ryan and Appos' truck was gone. Lily was in the backyard with a bucket of sidewalk chalk, drawing something enormous near the fence, too absorbed to notice her grandmother watching from the back door. It was a good sign. Children didn't and Appos draw elaborate, sprawling things when they were frightened. They went small and contained. Whatever Lily was making out there was taking up most of the patio, and that felt in a small way like hope. Renee sat up at the kitchen table with her laptop and a yellow legal pad, cross-referencing the numbers Cho and Appos' office had flagged with the bank statements pulled up on Margaret and Appos' account. It didn't and Appos' take her long to find the first thread. End quote. Mom. Come look at this. End quote. Margaret sat. On the screen was a loan guarantee, the kind of paperwork requiring a cosigner when the primary borrower doesn't and Appos' qualify a loan. $82,000. A private lender out of Columbus. At the bottom on the cosigner line a signature. Renee Doyle. End quote. I Don and Appos' recognize this loan, end quote, Renee said. Her voice was even, but her free hand, flat on the table, was pressing down hard enough to whiten the knuckles. End quote. I and Appos' never heard of this lender. I Haven and Appos' lived in this state in 6 years. That is not my signature. End quote. Margaret looked at it. It was close, the R and the D were roughly right, the general shape, but the pressure was wrong, the connections between letters wrong. Margaret had watched her daughter sign her name 10,000 times over 38 years. End quote. How did you find this? End quote. End quote. Cho and Appos' office sent a supplemental document request through the court channel this afternoon. It came up attached to a secondary account under Nicole and Appos' name, end quote. Renee scrolled. End quote. 82,000 co-signed in my name, taken out 14 months ago. Monthly payments are coming out of a joint account Ryan doesn't and Appos' even know exists. End quote. End quote. She used your information from family paperwork, end quote. Margaret said slowly, working it through. End quote. Your credit history, your income. She had enough on file to fill out an application, and she used my address as security. End quote. Renee and Appos' jaw was tight. End quote. Mom, this is forgery. This is identity theft. That and Appos' a felony, not a civil matter. End quote. Margaret looked at her daughter, 38 years old, Frank, and Appos' steadiness in her, going very still the way her father used to when he was most determined. End quote. We take this to Cho today, end quote, Margaret said. End quote. Already called. We have an 11:00 and Appos' clock tomorrow. End quote. Renee pulled a second printed sheet from her folder. End quote. There and Appos' something else. The loan payments aren't and Appos' the only thing running through that account. End quote. Rows of transactions, dates down the left, amounts in red on the right. End quote. A cleaning service, a subscription box, restaurant charges, all of it billed under a business name that doesn't and Appos' seem to actually exist. Larkspur Home Solutions LLC. End quote. End quote. There and Appos' no such company registered, end quote. Margaret said, understanding. End quote. Not in this state, no. It and Appos' a shell. She and Appos' been laundering personal spending through something that looks, on paper, like a legitimate household service, end quote. Margaret stood and went to the window. Lily and Appos' chalk drawing was still visible on the patio, faded by the afternoon, and Appos' heat, but there. A dog, round-bodied, tail curled up like a question mark. A dog drawn by a child who still believed, in spite of everything, that wanting something hard enough was the first step toward getting it. End quote. Does Ryan know about the Shell account? End quote. End quote. I Don and Appos' think so, end quote, Renee said. End quote. She and Appos' kept it separate. His name I sent and Appos' on any of it. End quote. Behind them, footsteps on the stairs, light, deliberate. Nicole and Apo's rhythm unmistakable. End quote. Ryan and Apo's voice low, compressed, the way voices sound when someone is speaking quietly from inside a car. End quote. Can you talk? End quote. End quote. I can talk. Are you alone? End quote. End quote. Mostly. End quote. A pause. End quote. I and Apo's in the parking lot at the hardware store on Route 9. Didn't and Apo's want to call from the house. End quote. That told her enough on its own. End quote. All right, Ryan. Say what you called to say. End quote. She heard him breathe in, breathe out. When he spoke again, the compressed quality was gone. His voice rough at the edges, the way it used to get as a teenager when he and Apo's done something he couldn't and Apo's figure out how to admit to. End quote. I knew about the account, end quote, he said. End quote. Not everything. Not the amount. But I knew she was moving money around. End quote. End quote. How long? End quote. End quote. About a year, end quote. He pushed past the silence before she could fill it. End quote. I told myself it was temporary. That she was managing things while I got my feet back under me after Dad. That she and Apo's square it eventually. End quote. End quote. Ryan, I know. End quote. End quote. I knew it wasn't an Apo's right. End quote. His voice cracked, split right down the middle. End quote. And I kept telling myself it was fine. I kept telling myself that until, end quote, he stopped. Started again. End quote. Until I watched Lily walk past me at that birthday dinner and go straight to you instead. My own daughter. She didn't end Apo's even look at me. End quote. Margaret pressed the phone harder to her ear and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. Some truths Dawn and Apo's need an answer. They only need to be spoken out loud finally by the person who and Apo's been carrying them. End quote. She told me if I ever sided with you, she and Apo's take Lily and I and Apo's never see her again, end quote, Ryan said. End quote, said she and Apo's tell the court I was the one who hurt her, that she had proof, end quote. His breath was unsteady. End quote. I believed her, Mom. God help me, I believed her. End quote. End quote. She and Apo's been building that threat a long time, end quote, Margaret said. End quote. I understand that now. End quote. A long pause. End quote. She isolated me. You remember Dave Anders? He coached Lily and Apo's soccer team last fall, end quote. End quote. I remember him. End quote. End quote. Nicole made me stop seeing him about 2 months after we started dating way back. Said he was a bad influence, said he didn't and Apo's respect her. End quote. Ryan and Apo's voice went flat. End quote. She did that to every friend I had. One by one until there was nobody left who hadn't and Apo's been approved or gotten rid of, end quote. He gave a short, humorless laugh. End quote. I used to tell myself I and Apo's just outgrown those guys. Took me a long time to realize I didn't and Apo's outgrow anybody. She edited my life down to just her. End quote. Margaret looked out at the street, at the flag by a neighbor and Apo's mailbox, at the flower boxes Frank had always admired on his evening walks. She thought about what Renee had said about the pattern, the isolation, the control, the threats, and how long her son had been inside that pattern, long enough to lose the ability to see its edges. End quote. Son, end quote, she said. End quote. Do you want to help Lily? End quote. A silence with real weight to it. Not emptiness. Wait. End quote. Yes. End quote. End quote. Then I need you to write down everything you remember. Every date, every incident, everything that didn't and Apo's sit right. Dawn and Apo's filter it. Dawn and Apo's decide what matters. Write it all down and get it to Cho. End quote. End quote. And then what? End quote. End quote. And then you let me and Adrian Cho handle the rest. End quote. Another pause. End quote. Who and Apo's Adrian Cho? End quote. End quote. Your father and Apo's lawyer, end quote, Margaret said. End quote. He hired him a year before he died. He knew this was coming, Ryan. He prepared for it. We and Apo's just finishing what he started. End quote. She could hear her son trying to absorb that, the sound of a man recalculating everything he thought he and Apo's D understood about the last 2 years. It was a great deal to take in at once. She gave him the time. End quote, okay, end quote. He said finally, quieter now, younger sounding than he had in years. End quote, I and Apo's am sorry. For all of it. For not stopping her sooner. For not being, end quote. He stopped himself. End quote. You and Apo's being better right now, end quote, Margaret said. End quote, that and Apo's what matters tonight. End quote. She heard him exhale long and shaking. The sound of something held too long finally let go. End quote, okay, end quote, he said again. End quote, I and Apo's I'll write it down. End quote. End quote, good man. End quote. She stayed on the porch a while after hanging up, listening to the neighborhood settle into evening. Through the screen door she could hear Renee and Apo's keyboard faint and steady. She thought about the version of Nicole she and Apo's D believed in for 6 years, warm, capable, a woman other people at church said Margaret was lucky to have, and wondered how much of that woman had ever been real, and how much had been a performance staged for an audience Nicole had never once let out of her sight. A week passed the way weeks pass when something large is moving beneath the surface of ordinary life. Slow on top, fast underneath. Renee took a leave of absence from her practice and set up permanently at the kitchen table, color-coded folders multiplying by the day. Margaret managed the house, made Lily and Apo's breakfast every morning, eggs and toast, pancakes on the days Lily seemed to need something extra, fixed the porch step that had been loose since spring, replaced the light fixture in the upstairs bathroom Nicole had been asking Ryan to fix since February and that he and Apo's D somehow never gotten to. Ryan started sleeping in the guest room 3 nights after the birthday dinner. Nicole hadn't and Apo's T commented on it in Margaret and Apo's presence, which told Margaret she was choosing her battles. Nicole moved through the house with careful pleasantness, performing normalcy with the effort of a woman who knew she was being watched and couldn't and Apo's afford to slip again. On the 7th morning, Renee called Margaret into the kitchen at 7 a.m. with the particular look Margaret had learned to read across 38 years. The look of a woman who and Apo's D found something and was choosing how to say it. End quote, sit down, Mom. End quote. Margaret sat. End quote, Cho and Apo's office got a supplemental disclosure back from the assessment firm yesterday. End quote, Renee said. End quote, there and Apo's a 4th visit we didn't and Apo's know about. A month before Dad died. End quote. Margaret went very still. End quote, while your father was still. End quote. End quote, yes. End quote. Renee turned the laptop around. An invoice dated, description reading initial capacity screening. Deceased. End quote. She started this before Dad died, Mom. Not after. He wasn't an Apo's the target of the last visits. You were always the target. She was laying groundwork more than 2 years ago. End quote. Margaret sat with that a long moment, feeling something shift and resettle inside her. Not quite surprise, more the grim confirmation of a suspicion she hadn't and Apo's let herself fully form. End quote, that and Apo's why he built the trapdoor, end quote, she said slowly. End quote. He wasn't and Apo's preparing for a stranger and Apo's cruelty. He was watching it happen in his own house to his own wife while he was dying, and he couldn't and Apo's stop it, so he made sure someone else could after, end quote. End quote, there and Apo's more, end quote, Renee said gently. End quote. I want you to hear this from me before you hear it in a deposition. End quote. She pulled up a second document, a credit report several years old from before Ryan and Nicole married. End quote. I did some digging into Nicole and Apo's history. Before you say anything, I know it and Apo's not strictly relevant to the case, and Cho may not even use it. But I think it matters for understanding her, and I didn't and Apo's want you blindsided. End quote. Nicole, it turned out, had grown up the second of 4 children in a house that lost its financial footing more than once, a father whose small business had failed twice, a family that had, for a stretch of her adolescence, lived out of a series of short-term rentals while creditors caught up with them. There was an old local news clipping, a foreclosure notice, a photograph of a 15-year-old Nicole standing on a porch that was no longer hers, arms crossed, chin up, refusing to look like a girl who and oppose. D just lost her house. End quote. It doesn't and oppose. Margaret had told him that morning, standing in the hallway outside the guest room, and he and oppose. D looked at her a long moment before nodding once and saying he and oppose. D be there. Nicole did not know. That was deliberate. Renee arranged the chairs. Dolores sat beside Margaret. Walt took the seat nearest the door. An old habit, Margaret suspected, from decades of a working life that had taught him to always know where the exit was. Ryan came down at 5 to 7 and took the chair at the far end, farthest from where Nicole would sit. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was still adjusting to its weight, jaw set, hands quiet on the table, eyes clearer than they and oppose. D been in months. Nicole came down at 7 on the dot, read the room in under 2 seconds, the folders on the table, Dolores and oppose, S expression, Walt and oppose, S posture, Ryan not beside her, and something moved across her face like weather crossing a valley. Fast and then gone. End quote. What is this? End quote. End quote. Sit down, Nicole, end quote, Margaret said. She sat. She didn't and oppose. T have a choice and she knew it, and the knowing of it was visible in the set of her shoulders. Margaret opened the first folder. End quote. On May 9th, 21st and June 3rd of this year, a representative from Cascadia Assessment Group entered this house while I was at a medical appointment. You commissioned those visits to support a conservatorship petition that would have transferred legal control of my finances, my property, and my medical decisions to you. End quote. She slid the paperwork across the table. End quote. The petition has not been filed. It will not be filed. Cho and oppose. S office has already notified the county clerk. End quote. Nicole didn't and oppose. T touched the document. Her face had gone very still. End quote. Over the past 2 years, end quote. Margaret continued, end quote. $162,000 was withdrawn from my personal account through a card issued in your name. None of it was authorized for personal use. That is financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. It and oppose. S.A. felony. End quote. Renee laid out the loan guarantee next, her own forged signature at the bottom. End quote. $82,000 co-signed in my name, for a loan I never took out from a lender I and oppose. We never heard of. That and oppose, S forgery. That and oppose, S identity theft. Also felonies, end quote. Nicole and oppose, S eyes went briefly to her phone on the table. Her lawyer and oppose, S number no doubt sitting one tap away, and then back up to Margaret. End quote. You have no idea what you and oppose. Redoing, end quote. She said low, controlled barely. End quote. Ryan. Say something. End quote. Ryan looked at his wife from the end of the table. End quote. I already said what I needed to say. To my mother. 3 weeks ago. End quote. End quote. You talked to her? End quote. End quote. I told her the truth, end quote, Ryan said. End quote. About the account. About what I knew and what I should have said a long time ago. End quote. His voice didn't and oppose, T-shake. Nicole turned back to Margaret and made one last attempt, the way a person does when they can see the exits closing. End quote. Whatever you think you have, it one and oppose. T hold up. You and oppose. A grieving old woman looking for someone to blame for. End quote. End quote. This is my house, end quote. Margaret said, quiet and even. End quote. My name has been on the deed for 22 years. Yours has not, end quote. She leaned forward slightly. End quote. And as of this morning, our attorney has filed the formal notice. You have 30 days. That and oppose. S what the law requires and that and oppose. S what you and oppose, LL get. End quote. The kitchen went very quiet. Outside, through the open window, a cicada started up and then thought better of it. Nicole stood, picked up her phone, looked around the table, Dolores, Walt, Renee, Ryan, all of them assembled in the kitchen of a house that had never been hers, and understood fully and finally that there was no version of this evening where she walked away holding anything. End quote. You and oppose, LL regret this, end quote, she said. End quote. The only thing I regret, end quote, Margaret said, end quote, is that it took me this long, end quote. Nicole left the kitchen, her heels on the stairs. The bedroom door closed firmly. not slammed, which surprised Margaret. The last controlled performance of a woman who refused to let anyone watch her lose. Lily appeared in the hallway doorway a moment later, pajamas, sock feet, silent on the tile. She and Appos D been upstairs. She and Appos D heard some of it. Margaret could tell by the careful way she was holding herself. End quote, Grandma. Is it okay? End quote. Margaret pushed her chair back and held out her arms, and Lily came to her, and Margaret felt the small body relax by degrees, like a fist slowly opening. End quote, it and Appos. "'S going to be okay, sweet girl," end quote, Margaret said. End quote, I promise you that. End quote. It did not go smoothly from there, though Margaret would later admit she and Appos D half expected it to, in the naive way people expect a thing to be simpler once the truth is finally out in the open. 3 weeks before the trial date, Cho called with news that put a small crack in Margaret and Appos' confidence for the first time since the tin box. End quote. Their attorney is arguing the neighbor and Appos' recordings are inadmissible, end quote, he said. End quote. Fen and Appos' property line runs closer to yours than we realized. There and Appos' a question of whether some of the footage technically captured private space rather than shared yard, which could trigger consent issues under state law, end quote. End quote. Can they win that argument? End quote. End quote. I Don and Appos T think so. But I won and Appos T lied to you, it and Appos not nothing. If the judge excludes even a portion of that footage, we lean harder on the journal, the financial records, and Frank and Appos' testimony, which is still substantial. But it would have been cleaner with everything intact. End quote. Margaret sat with that for a night, the old fear creeping back in. The fear that had kept her quiet for 2 years, the fear that doing something and having it fail was worse than doing nothing at all. She thought about Frank and Appos' note. Let her find this when she and Appos' desperate enough to finally let someone help. She had let someone help. She wasn't and Appos' going to let a technicality talk her back into silence. She called Dolores the next morning. End quote. I want you to walk the fence line with Cho and Appos' investigator, end quote, Margaret said. End quote. Show them exactly where you stood for each recording. If some of it doesn't and Appos' hold up, I want to know before we and Appos' standing in a courtroom finding out. End quote. The investigator and Appos' assessment 3 days later was better than Cho had feared. 19 of the 23 recordings were clean, taken clearly from Dolores and Appos' own property looking into shared outdoor space. 4 were excluded. It was enough of a scare to remind Margaret, in a way the previous weeks of steady momentum hadn't, and Appos' that nothing about this was guaranteed. It made her hold on tighter to what remained, rather than looser. The deposition was scheduled for the 2nd week of November. Margaret drove downtown with Renee beside her and the accordion folder on the back seat, Frank and Appos' photograph in her coat pocket where she and Appos' been carrying it since the morning she found the tin. The conference room had been rearranged since their first visit. The long table cleared, a court reporter already seated in the corner. Cho stood when they came in. End quote. Ready? End quote. End quote. Ready, end quote, Margaret said. Nicole arrived at 9 with her attorney, a man named Gregory Voss, silver-templed, the kind of calm that costs several $100s an hour to maintain. Nicole had dressed carefully, navy blazer, not a hair out of place, and sat across the table with an expression Margaret recognized immediately. The company face. Rebuilt piece by piece over 3 months. Cho started at the foundation, conversational, the tone that lulls a witness into thinking the hard part hasn't and Appos' started yet. How long had Nicole lived at the Larkspur Lane property? What was her relationship to Lily? How would she characterize the household? Nicole answered smoothly. She was good at this. Margaret had always known she was good at this. Then Cho opened a folder. End quote. Mrs. Doyle, Lily and Appos' pediatric records show 4 visits over 18 months prior to this June for injuries described as accidental. A bruised forearm in February. A split lip in April. Contusions on her shoulder in September. Walk me through the circumstances of each. End quote. End quote. Children have accidents, end quote, Nicole said. End quote. She and Appos' an active girl. End quote. End quote. Active, end quote, Cho repeated. He opened another tab. End quote. Dr. Elena Marsh, who evaluated Lily over 5 sessions this fall, describes her. Cho let the objection stand and played the second clip. Margaret watched Nicole watch herself. Her hand on the table had stopped moving. End quote, Mrs. Doyle, end quote, Cho said once the clips ended, end quote. In your own words, how would you describe Lily and Apos' place in your family? End quote. End quote, she and Apos' my daughter. End quote. End quote, and you love her? End quote. End quote, of course I love her. End quote. Cho reached into his folder and set a piece of paper in the center of the table. A child and Apos' drawing, green crayon, an old woman and a small girl walking hand in hand under a crooked branch tree, and underneath in uneven capital letters, me and grandma. Home. End quote. Then help me understand, end quote, Cho said, end quote, why your 6-year-old daughter drew this and asked whether a judge could be shown it. End quote. Nicole looked at the drawing. For seconds past, Margaret counted them, and in those 4 seconds, for the first time in everything that had happened between them, the company face dissolved completely. Not into anger. Not into tears. Into something emptier than either. Voss leaned over and said something quietly at Nicole and Apos' ear. End quote, I and Apos' like to request a recess, end quote, he said. End quote, of course, end quote, Cho said. End quote. 10 minutes. End quote. In the hallway, Renee exhaled long and slow as though she and Apos' been holding it most of the morning. End quote. He and Apos' good, end quote, she said, almost smiling. End quote. Frank picked him, end quote, Margaret said. Renee and Apos' jaw worked, she kept herself together. End quote, trial and Apos' in 3 weeks. End quote. End quote, I know. End quote. End quote, you ready? End quote. Margaret and Apos' hand found the edge of the photograph in her coat pocket. Smooth border. A slight curl at one corner from months of handling. End quote, I and Apos' been ready, end quote, she said, end quote, since the night I found that tin. End quote. The county courthouse sat at the top of a hill on Main Street, the way old courthouses in small towns so often do, as if the town had decided long ago that justice ought to be visible from a distance. The morning of the trial was clear and cold, the air thin the way it gets in December, and Margaret stood on the front steps a moment before going in, looking out over the town Frank had never lived to see her fight for, in this exact building, over this exact thing. Renee took her arm on the way up, not because Margaret needed steadying, but because Renee did. The courtroom was smaller than the version Margaret had built in her head over months of imagining it. Wood paneling, fluorescent light, benches that smelled faintly of old varnish. Dolores sat in the front row of the gallery, Walt beside her logbook, Margaret noticed, left at home for the first time in months. Ryan sat 3 rows back, alone, in a gray jacket Margaret recognized from his college graduation, 17 years old now and somehow still fitting him. Nicole came in with Gregory Voss and sat without looking at anyone. Judge Patricia Hale entered, early 60s, silver hair cropped close, reading glasses on a chain, the unhurried economy of someone who had presided over enough human wreckage to have stopped being surprised by any particular shape of it. End quote, we and Apos' here in the matter of Doyle versus Doyle, end quote, she said. End quote. Petition for guardianship of a minor, and related financial claims. Counsel ready. End quote. End quote. Ready, Your Honor, end quote, said Cho. End quote. Ready, end quote, said Voss. End quote. Then let and Apos' begin. End quote. Cho and Apos' opening was 8 minutes, unhurried, laying the facts out in the order they and Apos' happened and letting the order do the work. A grandmother, a grandchild, a household where a 6-year-old had learned to hide food and draw pictures of locked rooms, 2 years of financial exploitation, a forged signature, a fraudulent conservatorship scheme, a woman who had spent 2 years dismantling the safety net of a recently widowed woman while presenting, to everyone who knew her, the face of a devoted daughter-in-law. Voss and Apos' opening leaned hard on the word family, how complicated families are, how grief distorts perception, how an elderly widow and Apos' household tension could be misread as something darker than it was. He was not a bad lawyer. He was working with what he had. Dr. Elena Marsh took the stand first and described, In clinical language that landed harder than any emotional appeal could have, what she and Oppos D observed in Lily over 5 sessions. Hypervigilance, parentified behavior, an inability to receive unexpected physical affection without flinching. End quote. In your professional opinion, end quote, Cho asked, end quote, was this child living in an environment that caused her psychological harm? End quote. End quote. Yes, end quote. Dr. Marsh said without qualification. The guardian ad litem, a woman named Carol Reyes appointed to represent Lily and Oppos' own interests, was brief and precise. She had met with Lily 3 times, reviewed the full case file. End quote. In your assessment, does the guardianship arrangement proposed by the petitioner serve this child and Oppos' best interests? End quote. End quote. Without question. End quote. Then Cho stood, and the room seemed to lean forward with him. End quote. Your Honor, the petitioner would like to introduce Exhibit 23, a video recorded by the late Frank Doyle 6 weeks before his death. End quote. Voss objected on authentication grounds. Cho produced the notarized documentation. The objection was overruled. The screen lit up and Frank and Oppos' voice filled the room. Margaret had heard it twice already, once alone in her bedroom in the dark, once with Renee beside her. She had told herself she was prepared for a 3rd time. She was not nearly prepared enough. He talked about Lily first, what he and Oppos' D seen, what he and Oppos' D written down, what he and Oppos' D been afraid of and why, his voice steady and specific, giving dates like a man who knew his testimony might be the last useful thing he ever did. Then he said her name. Maggie. Margaret and Oppos' jaw locked. Her eyes burned. She kept her feet flat on the floor and her spine straight and let everything happening in her chest happen without trying to stop it. Beside her, Renee and Oppos' hand found her arm. You and Oppos' V spent our whole marriage taking care of everybody but yourself, and you think that and Oppos' just who you are, but it isn't and Oppos' Maggie, it and Oppos' a habit, and habits can be broken. You built this family out of nothing but stubbornness and love, and I have watched you fix things nobody else in this world would even try to fix. You can fix this too. I know you can because I know you and I have always known you better than you know yourself. The tears came then. Not the careful release of that first night alone, but total sudden the way weather moves. Margaret did not stop them and did not hide them. She sat in that courtroom with Frank and Oppos' voice in the air around her and let 70 years of holding things together come apart for exactly as long as it needed to. Then she breathed in and straightened and kept watching the screen. Not one person in the courtroom made a sound. When the video ended, Judge Hale removed her glasses and looked at Nicole for a long moment without speaking. Voss walked Nicole through her own testimony carefully, rebuilding the narrative piece by piece. She held together for the first 20 minutes. Then Cho stood for cross-examination, moved through the financial records, the shell company, Renee and Oppos' forged signature, and Nicole and Oppos' answers grew shorter, her pauses longer. End quote. Mrs. Doyle, end quote. Cho said finally, end quote. How would you describe Lily and Oppos' role in your family? End quote. End quote. She and Oppos' my daughter. End quote. End quote. And her presence in your home, was that something you welcomed? End quote. Pause half a beat too long. End quote. Of course. End quote. End quote. Then help me understand something. End quote. Cho and Oppos' voice stayed even, unhurried. End quote. I have 19 videos, a psychological assessment, a child and Oppos' drawings, and the recorded testimony of a dying man, and every piece of it tells the same story. End quote. He leaned forward slightly. End quote. I and Oppos' I'll ask you directly. Did you love that child? End quote. Nicole and Oppos' hands flat on the table pressed down. Her jaw worked. Something moved behind her eyes, calculation or collapse or both at once. And then she said in a voice that came out too fast, too unguarded to take back. End quote. That kid has always been a burden. End quote. The courtroom exhaled as one body. Judge Hale set down her pen. Voss closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Cho said nothing at all. He simply looked at the judge, and the judge looked at Nicole, and Nicole understood. Margaret could see the exact moment she understood. that nothing said after that sentence by any lawyer in any tone was going to undo it. Judge Hale took 40 minutes with her notes. When she returned, she read the ruling in full. Permanent guardianship of Lily Doyle awarded to Margaret Doyle. All financial claims. June came back around the way it always did in Ohio. Sudden and warm honeysuckle thick along the back fence. The particular sweetness in the air that makes you forget the winter had ever happened. 1 year. 1 full year since Margaret had sat at a birthday table and heard a sound she and Oppos D never fully unhear, and stood up and said 7 words that had changed everything that came after them. She was in the kitchen at 6 that morning, still in her robe, when Lily found her. Pajamas printed with rockets, hair standing up on one side, dragging a stuffed rabbit by one ear across the tile with the gravity of someone settling in for a serious conversation. End quote. Is it my birthday, Grandma? End quote. End quote. It is. End quote. End quote. Am I 7 now? End quote. End quote. You are 7 now. End quote. Lily looked at her own hands, turning them over once, as if 7 might look different from 6, and she wanted to check. Then she looked up with eyes that had, over the past year, slowly stopped flinching at footsteps, stopped scanning doorways before she walked through them, eyes that had started, at last, to look at the world the way a child and Oppos' eyes are meant to, openly, without armor. End quote. Grandma, can we have pancakes? End quote. Margaret laughed. A real laugh, the kind that starts low and comes out before you can stop it. End quote. We can absolutely have pancakes. End quote. Renee arrived at 9 with a box wrapped so large she had to carry it sideways through the front door. Lily stood in front of it, arms crossed, attempting patience for approximately 4 seconds before she started bouncing on her heels. End quote. You can and Oppos open it until after lunch. End quote. Renee told her. End quote. That and Oppos' a long time. End quote. End quote. It is. Life and Oppos' full of waiting. End quote. Lily considered this seriously. End quote. Is that true, Grandma? End quote. End quote. Unfortunately, end quote, Margaret said. She accepted this with the particular dignity of a 7-year-old who had decided, somewhere along the last year, to trust the adults around her, which was, in Margaret and Oppos' estimation, the most valuable thing that had happened in the whole of it. That slow, hard-won return of trust, rebuilt one predictable morning at a time, one same face across the breakfast table at a time, until the girl who used to hide bread under her pillow slept through the night without once waking to check the world was still where she and Oppos' left it. Dolores arrived with a casserole and the blue cardigan with the pearl buttons that had become, in Margaret and Oppos' mind, the garment she wore for occasions that mattered. Walt showed up 10 minutes later, logbook nowhere in evidence, left at home, which told Margaret everything about how the day felt different from all the ones that had led to it. Ryan came at noon. He stood on the porch a moment before knocking. Margaret saw him from the kitchen window, hands in his pockets, looking at the flag by the mailbox, the flower boxes Frank had always admired. Then he knocked. Lily answered because Lily answered every door now, a new habit born of new confidence. The confidence of a child who no longer had to check whether a visitor was safe before deciding whether she wanted to be seen. End quote. Hey kiddo, end quote, Ryan said. Lily studied her father a moment with the careful assessment of a girl who had learned the difference between the people who show up and the people who don and Oppos' Then she stepped back and pulled the door wide. End quote. We and Oppos' having pancakes, end quote, she said. End quote. Well, we already had pancakes. But there might be more. End quote. Ryan looked at Margaret over his daughter and Oppos' head. Margaret nodded once. He came inside. They ate around the kitchen table, Renee, Dolores, Walt, Ryan, Lily, Margaret, and the conversation moved the way good conversation moves when the people having it have come through something hard together and out the other side of it. Long stretches of ordinary talk about ordinary things. Lily ate more at one sitting than Margaret had ever seen her eat. She did not look behind her once. After lunch, the box. For minutes and considerable damage to the wrapping paper before Lily got it open. A bicycle, blue-white handlebars, a bell, training wheels Renee had already arranged privately to have removed by August, which Margaret had agreed to privately, and which Lily did not yet know. She stood with both hands on the handlebars, mouth open, and then looked at her aunt and said, end quote, thank you, end quote, with a sincerity that made Renee press her lips together hard. They took it outside. Ryan walked beside Lily down the driveway, one hand hovering near the back of the seat without quite touching it, close enough to catch her if she wobbled, far enough back to let her find her own balance. Margaret watched from the porch, Dolores on one side, Walt on the other, the June light going long and gold across the yard. End quote. She and Apo's going to be all right, end quote, Dolores said. End quote. She is, end quote, Margaret agreed. Walt put a hand on her shoulder once and took it away, which was Walt and Apo's way of saying everything he never said out loud. That evening, after 7 candles blown out in one triumphant breath, Margaret slipped away to her room for a moment. She took the photograph from the nightstand, where it had lived since the morning after the trial, the morning she and Apo's decided it belonged somewhere she could see it, rather than somewhere she kept it close out of need. Lily asleep on Frank and Apo's shoulder. Autumn light through a window. His handwriting on the back. Fight for her. End quote. We did, Frank, end quote, she said, and her voice came out steady, the voice of a woman who has finished something and knows it. End quote. We did. End quote. From down the hall came Lily and Apo's voice, high and bright, telling Renee something about the bicycle with the specific urgency of a child who cannot believe the adults around her. Haven and Apo's yet grasped how important this information is. Ryan and Apo's laugh answered her, real and unguarded, the laugh of a man still learning how to use it again. Margaret set the photograph back on the nightstand, beside the tin, and the folded drawing that still read me and Grandma home. Then she went back down the hall to her family. I waited too long. That is the truth I still carry. For 2 years I told myself patience was the same thing as wisdom, that staying quiet was the same thing as keeping peace. It wasn't an Apo's tea. It was fear, dressed up in a reasonable coat. And while I wore it, a little girl learned to hide food under her pillow and draw pictures of rooms with no doors. If there and Apo's one thing I and Apo's cross a street to tell a stranger it and Apo's this, the people who love us Don and Apo's always get to stay. But sometimes if we and Apo's lucky, they leave us everything we need to finish what they started. Frank couldn't and Apo's be here. But he made sure his love was Don and Apo's wait the way I waited. If something feels wrong in your home around a child who has gone too quiet, trust that. Act on it. You Don and Apo's need a courtroom and a year of paperwork to stand up in your own kitchen and say not in my house. Family ISN and Apo's a name on a document. Family is who shows up, who stays, who fights when fighting is the only loving thing left to do.